Behind the feast lies a silence darker than wine. Welcome to Wolfe's Casebook. I am your host, Mr. Enigma. Drop a comment with your location. I always read them. Your voices make this journey richer. The story starts now. It started with a dinner party, which is exactly the kind of event Wolfe has avoided all his life. Not hosting one. He'd sooner lease the orchids to a circus, but being invited to one. Invitations arrive often enough, usually embossed on linen and brimming with the misplaced confidence that Wolfe would ever leave the brownstone for anything short of a funeral. His own, maybe. But this invitation was different. It came tucked inside a silver envelope, hand-delivered by a woman who looked like she'd never been kept waiting a day in her life. I opened the door and she handed it to me without a word. Then she turned on her heel and disappeared down the steps, before I could ask who she was or what brand of perfume she'd weaponized. The envelope had no return address, just Wolfe's name written in looping script, the kind that belonged on old deeds or love letters. Inside was a card, plain except for the words, "Mr. Wolfe is cordially invited to a private dinner at the home of Harold Vance this Saturday at 8. Attendance is expected. Matters of discretion and importance will be discussed over the meal. Bring your appetite." I carried it into the office and dropped it on Wolfe's desk like a poker hand I wasn't sure about. He was already in position, lowered into the chair that creaked in protest under the weight of genius and girth. His eyes skimmed the card once, then closed as if retreating from the sight. "Archie," he said. "Yes, sir." "Burn it." "Sure, but before I toss it in the flames, maybe you should know the sender. Harold Vance, big name in real estate. Owns half of Midtown and the other half owes him money." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "A man who builds glass towers and calls it empire. His feast would be vulgar." "Maybe, but the wording here, attendance is expected. That's not the kind of phrase you get on a party invite. That's more like a summons." Wolfe's lips compressed, which meant I wasn't wrong. He opened his eyes again and reached for his beer, sipped and set it down. "Harold Vance presumes much. So what's our play? Ignore it?" "Ignore, yes. But not dismiss. If Vance wishes to see me, he will come here. This house is not to be trespassed upon lightly." I thought that was the end of it, until 3 hours later when the phone rang. Fritz answered, and his eyebrows nearly climbed into his hairline. He carried the receiver into the office like it might explode and said, "Mr. Vance insists." Wolfe took the call himself, which was rare enough to make me sit up straighter. His half of the conversation was sparse. "Yes." "We impossible." "Pfui." Then, after a pause, he said, "Very well. Archie will attend." When he hung up, I stared at him. "Archie will attend? That's news to Archie." "You will go in my stead," Wolfe said, already closing his eyes again. "Observe, report. Eat if the food is tolerable. But most of all, listen. Something compels Harold Vance to gather a table of guests. We must know what. Why not send Saul? Because Saul listens too well. I require interpretation, wit, skepticism. In short, you." That was Wolfe's idea of flattery, reminding me I was his witless errand boy with a knack for noticing things he already knew. Still, I had to admit the whole setup smelled off. A powerful man summoning Wolfe to dinner, only to settle for me as a substitute. Either he was desperate or he thought he was clever. I wasn't sure which was more dangerous. Saturday night found me in a tux I hadn't worn since Prohibition, standing in the grand foyer of Harold Vance's townhouse. The place looked like someone had emptied a European palace into a Manhattan brownstone. Marble columns, velvet drapes, chandeliers that could have lit Times Square. A butler took my coat, eyed me like I was a trespasser, and ushered me toward the dining room. The table was set for 8. Vance himself sat at the head, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with a smile that showed just enough teeth. Around him were 7 others, each one a face you'd recognize from a newspaper or a lawsuit. There was a lawyer with a reputation for burying enemies in paperwork, a socialite whose gossip column could ruin careers, a rival developer with more enemies than friends, and a couple whose jewelry sparkled louder than their conversation. The last seat opposite Vance was waiting for me. Vance rose slightly, offered a hand and said, "Mr. Goodwin, welcome. I regret Mr. Wolfe could not join us, but you will suffice." "I'm flattered," I said, taking the seat. "But you should know Wolfe doesn't usually send doggy bags." The table chuckled uneasily. Vance didn't. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said, "What will be discussed tonight concerns him whether he dines here or not. Secrets are being traded, Mr. Goodwin. Secrets that kill reputations, and sometimes more than reputations." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just dinner. This was bait. And if Wolfe had sent me, it meant he already suspected the hook hiding under the garnish. The meal itself might have fooled a less suspicious man, but I've been around Wolfe long enough to know that elaborate dishes often come served with a side of poison. Not the literal kind, though judging by the anxious glances around the table, I wouldn't have ruled it out. The first course was some kind of chilled consommé that probably took a small army of chefs to produce. I took a spoonful, let it sit, and focused on what I was really there for. The people. Harold Vance presided like a judge at trial, only his gavel was the fork he tapped against his plate when he wanted silence. His eyes roved over the table, sharp and probing, daring anyone to look away first. At his right sat Althea Drake, the socialite columnist whose pen could kill reputations faster than any bullet. She had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and a laugh that belonged in print more than in person. Beside her was Malcolm Sloane, a developer whose empire often overlapped and collided with Vance's. The tension between the two of them hummed under the polite chatter, sharp as a wire pulled taut. Across from them sat Burton Hale, a lawyer whose specialty was making enemies disappear into endless litigation. I'd seen his name in more than one headline about cases where the winner wasn't the better side, just the side that could afford him longer. Next to Hale was a couple in their 40s, dripping diamonds, Mr. and Mrs. Clifford Harrow. He looked perpetually distracted, as if running numbers in his head, while she fluttered her pearls and leaned into every conversation, as though she was desperate not to miss a single secret. That left one other guest. Seated at the far end near me, a wiry man with restless fingers named Julian Kearns. I didn't know him, but the way the others kept sneaking glances suggested he wasn't just there for decoration. He spoke little, but when he did, the table fell quiet. The courses came and went. Wine was poured liberally, conversation less so. Vance allowed stretches of silence, like a maestro letting the tension build before a crescendo. Finally, after the third course, he set his fork down and looked directly at me. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "you are here as Nero Wolfe's proxy. That means you will listen, and you will convey what you hear." "Correct," I nodded. "I'm good at listening." "Conveying depends on whether Wolfe wants to hear it." That earned a chuckle from the Harrows, though it died quickly under Vance's glare. He leaned forward. "Then you will take this back to him. What we discuss tonight is not merely gossip. It is survival. Everyone at this table holds secrets, myself included. Secrets that could destroy fortunes, reputations, even lives if revealed. One of us has chosen to profit by them. One of us is a traitor." That got attention. Forks paused mid-air, wine glasses lowered. Even Sloane, who had been pretending disinterest, straightened slightly. Vance continued. "In recent weeks, information I shared in confidence has surfaced in the press. Deals compromised, associates embarrassed. Someone here has betrayed us. Tonight we identify them. Tonight we seal the matter." It was as good a time as any for me to wonder why Wolfe had sent me into the lion's den without so much as a pea-shooter. I kept my expression neutral and let my eyes wander. Althea Drake's lips tightened. Sloane's fingers drummed against the tablecloth. Hale cleared his throat. The Harrows exchanged a glance too quick to be affectionate, and Kearns just watched, his restless fingers still at last. "Mr. Wolfe will want proof," I said. "Accusations are cheap. Evidence is the only currency he spends." Vance's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Then observe carefully. By the end of this dinner, you will know who cannot be trusted. The next course arrived, duck with some elaborate reduction sauce. Nobody tasted it. The conversation fractured into careful exchanges, probing questions disguised as small talk. I caught snippets. Sloane pushing Vance about a failed land deal in Brooklyn. Drake needling Hale about a client whose indiscretions had just become public. Mrs. Harrow hinting she'd heard rumors of an affair involving someone very high up. Each word was a test, a measure of reaction. I played my part, dropping a few casual questions, seeing who dodged. Kearns remained a cipher, saying almost nothing, but his eyes tracked every speaker like a hawk's. When I asked him what business he was in, he smiled faintly and said, "Information. The purest commodity." Then he went silent again, leaving me to wonder if he was the betrayer or just the man who benefited from betrayal. Dessert was brought out, an elaborate confection I couldn't name, and that was when the real fireworks hit. Althea Drake set down her spoon and turned to Vance. "Harold," she said sweetly, "if you're looking for betrayal, perhaps you should start by checking your own pockets. After all, who benefits most from creating an atmosphere of fear? Who gathers us all here under pretense of fellowship, only to accuse us collectively?" Sloane grunted in agreement. "She's right. This whole performance reeks of misdirection." Vance's face darkened. "Nonsense. I've been wronged, and I will not be made the scapegoat. Someone here sold me out, and I will see them exposed. Or silenced." Hale said dryly. That line landed like a match on dry straw. Voices rose, accusations flew, and for a moment I thought the table might collapse under the weight of suspicion. Through it all, Kearns sat utterly still, his thin smile never wavering. Then Vance slammed his fist on the table. "Enough, the betrayer will reveal themselves soon enough, and when they do, there will be consequences." The meal ended not with coffee and cigars, but with tension so thick you could have carved it like roast beef. Guests departed in stiff silence, avoiding each other's eyes. Vance escorted me to the door personally, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Tell Wolfe," he said, "that what began tonight will not end quietly. He will be drawn in whether he wishes it or not." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting in his chair as if he'd been there since I left, which he probably had. I gave him the whole report, every word, every twitch, every sideways glance. He listened without interruption, eyes closed, lips pursed. When I finished, he opened his eyes at last. "Pfui," he said softly. "Vance has entangled himself in a web of secrets and dares to summon me into it. Very well. We shall see whose appetite consumes whom." And that was when I realized Wolfe had known from the start. That dinner hadn't just been bait for the guests. It had been bait for us. The morning after that little circus at Vance's table, the brownstone was as quiet as a cathedral, except for the faint scrape of Wolfe's spoon against his breakfast bowl. Fritz had outdone himself with shirred eggs and sausage, but Wolfe was treating it like penance, not pleasure. He had spent the last 20 minutes chewing in silence, eyes half shut, while I perched nearby waiting for my cue. Finally he set down his fork and spoke. "Archie," he said, "you will begin." That was Wolfe's version of a detailed strategy session. "Begin what?" "Breathing harder," filing my nails. Luckily, after years of translation duty, I knew what he meant. "You want me to start digging into our cast of dinner companions?" "Precisely." He reached for his beer, tilted it, and sighed. "One of them has transgressed. Vance fancies himself ringmaster, but he is the fool. We must identify the juggler who drops knives instead of pins." "Fine," I said. "I'll start with Althea Drake. She looked like she was ready to throw you under the bus before dessert was served." "Her tongue is sharper than her pen," Wolfe said. "But gossip is smoke, not fire. Do not dismiss her, but do not overestimate." He gestured once with those thick fingers, and I took it as dismissal. By noon I was uptown, climbing the marble steps to the editorial offices of the Chronicle. A secretary with lacquered hair and a glare sharp enough to cut rope informed me that Miss Drake was very busy. I said that was fine. I could wait, and made myself comfortable in the lobby until she caved. Drake swept out 20 minutes later, draped in mink and irritation. "If you're the messenger boy Wolfe sent, you can tell him I don't scare easily." "I'm not a messenger," I said, falling into step beside her. "I'm a collector. I collect facts, contradictions, and little remarks people wish they hadn't made. Wolfe likes me to keep the set complete." She stopped, turned on me with narrowed eyes. "What did he tell you about me? That you're dangerous with a pen but not with a plan. That you talk too much to be the betrayer." That gave her pause, though she covered it with a dry laugh. "Maybe Wolfe underestimates me. Maybe I'm sharper than he thinks." "Maybe," I said. "But you were the first to throw suspicion back at Vance. Why?" Her lips curled. "Because men like Vance always believe their secrets are the only ones worth keeping. He's afraid, Goodwin. That makes him clumsy. Whoever's betraying him isn't in that dining room. They're outside watching the show." I let her stalk off, heels clicking like gunshots. She hadn't given me proof, but she'd given me a thread. Either she was lying through her teeth, or she was telling me that Vance had bigger enemies than his dinner guests. Next stop was Malcolm Sloane's office, a monument of steel and glass downtown, where receptionists were trained to freeze blood with a glance. I introduced myself, and after a short wait that felt like a week, Sloane appeared, tall, lean, and impatient. "You're Wolfe's man," he said, not bothering to shake my hand. "What's his angle?" "Depends," I said. "What's yours?" He smirked. "Survival. Vance and I compete for the same land, the same money, the same influence. He thinks I betrayed him? Good. Let him think it. Fear keeps him off balance. You don't mind being the suspect?" Sloane leaned closer. "I mind nothing, Goodwin, because I know something none of you do, and that is that Harold Vance is lying. About everything. He's not the victim. He's the blackmailer." That one landed hard. Sloane straightened, flashed his teeth in a grin that was more snarl than smile, and walked away. I left with my head buzzing. If he was bluffing, it was a good one. If he wasn't, Wolfe had sent me into a deeper pit than I realized. I made one more stop before heading home, Julian Kearns. He wasn't in a glossy office or a society column. He was tucked into a cramped loft in Greenwich Village, where newspapers were stacked to the ceiling and the typewriter never seemed to stop clacking. He greeted me with a dry smile and waved me toward a chair already covered in files. "You're here for information," he said. "Always," I said. "And you're the man who sells it," he nodded. "True, and Harold Vance is one of my best customers. Or he was, until recently." "Why recently?" "Because he stopped paying, because someone else offered more, and because Vance began to fear me." He slid a folder across the desk. "Read." I opened it. Inside were clippings, letters, scraps of correspondence, every one of them tied to people at that dinner. Embarrassments, debts, affairs, scandals, secrets catalogued like butterflies. "You're telling me," I said, "that Vance bought your files and now someone else is buying them too?" "Not telling," Kearns said softly. "Showing. Whoever betrayed Vance did it through me. That was enough for me." I closed the folder, handed it back, and left before he decided I owed him for the privilege. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, eyes shut, lips pursed, as if he'd already sifted through my findings before I opened my mouth. I gave him the rundown. Drake's denial, Sloane's accusation, Kearns's evidence. He listened, expressionless, until I was done. Then he said, "Phooey, Vance pretends to be victim when he is extortionist. The question is not who betrayed him. The question is whom he betrayed first. That, Archie, will lead us to the hand behind this so-called feast." "Great," I said. "So the man who summoned us with soup and threats is sitting on a powder keg, and we're standing close enough to smell the fuse?" "Yes." Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes again. "It will ignite soon. We must be prepared when it does." That was Wolfe's way of saying the game was no longer observation. It was war. The next morning broke grey and wet, the kind of weather that makes New York look like it's been left out in the rain a century too long. Fritz was in the kitchen, scolding the grocer over limp spinach, and Wolfe was barricaded in the plant rooms with his orchids. That left me in the office with the telephone and my own curiosity. Wolfe had pronounced the previous night that Vance was an extortionist masquerading as a victim, which meant the real question was who had decided to turn his game back on him. I didn't need orchids to know that answer wouldn't float in through the window. The first call came from Althea Drake. She wasted no time with pleasantries. "Goodwin, I know you came sniffing around yesterday. I don't appreciate it. But you should know this. If Vance thinks I betrayed him, he'll use me as the scapegoat. And if Wolfe is letting that happen, you're playing with dynamite." "Lady," I said, "if Wolfe were in the dynamite business, he'd sell it wholesale and never strike a match. He's not in the business of scapegoats either." Her tone sharpened. "Then tell him this. Vance has a ledger. A red one. He carries it everywhere. Inside are the names of every person whose secrets he's bought and sold. If you want proof, find that ledger. Whoever gets it first wins." She hung up before I could reply, which was just as well. I phoned Saul Panzer, gave him the basics, and told him to keep eyes on Vance. If that red ledger existed, Vance wouldn't let it out of his sight. Then Saul could tail a flea through Central Park in the dark. By mid-afternoon I had another thread. Malcolm Sloane called me himself, which was unusual for a man who treated conversation like a billable service. His voice was dry but urgent. "Goodwin, Wolfe needs to understand. Vance isn't just bluffing with secrets. He's weaponizing them. He tried to corner me into a partnership by hinting he knew something about my finances. If he tries that in public, both of us burn. Tell Wolfe it's not just betrayal, it's blackmail at scale." That confirmed what Wolfe had already suspected, but it also told me Sloane was rattled enough to reach out. And when men like him rattled, something was close to breaking. When Wolfe came down from the orchids, I gave him both updates. He listened, eyes closed, while I recited Drake's tip about the ledger and Sloane's confession about blackmail. When I was done, he sighed like a man condemned to a second helping of dessert. "Archie," he said, "observe how swiftly desperation corrodes loyalty. Miss Drake, fearing scapegoat, betrays Vance's possession. Mr. Sloane, fearing ruin, confesses vulnerability. Both point to the same fulcrum, the ledger. That then is our objective." Meaning what? Meaning, pfui, that we must have it before any of them do. I didn't argue. Wolfe might despise leaving the house, but when he put weight on a single object like that ledger, it meant the whole case hinged on it. By evening, Saul phoned in. Vance went to a meeting at the Metropolitan Club, carried a slim briefcase, red leather locked. Never let it out of reach. He's treating it like a newborn. That was enough confirmation for Wolfe. He summoned me to the office, dictated a letter to Vance, and had me deliver it by hand. The wording was pure Wolfe, a refusal to be toyed with, a demand that if Vance wished to entangle him further, he must bring the ledger to the brownstone the following evening. It was bait, and Wolfe set it with the calm precision of a fisherman who knew the trout couldn't resist. When I returned from the errand, Fritz was setting dinner, pheasant with chestnuts, and Wolfe was already lowering himself into his chair. He waited until Fritz retreated before speaking. "Archie, tomorrow evening you will prepare the office. Arrange chairs enough for 6. Vance will come and he will bring others. He seeks validation, but I will strip him." 6 chairs, I said. "So you expect company?" "Of course. When a man dangles secrets, those he threatens flock like carrion birds. They will come to see if he wields the ledger, or if I do. Either way, we shall resolve it here." The next evening arrived with a storm snapping at the windows, a reminder that New York doesn't mind supplying atmosphere. I set the office as ordered. Wolfe's throne behind his desk, chairs arrayed in a semicircle facing him, and the globe polished in case I needed something to lean on. At 8 sharp, the doorbell rang. Fritz admitted Harold Vance, dripping rain and arrogance, briefcase clutched under his arm. Behind him came Althea Drake in sable, Sloane with his jaw tight, Hale the lawyer clutching his umbrella like a weapon, and the Harrows glittering uneasily. Julian Kearns was last. eyes bright, lips curved in that unsettling half-smile. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He gestured toward the chairs, and one by one they filled them, the room thick with perfume, damp wool, and tension. Vance remained standing, his red briefcase perched on Wolfe's desk like an offering. "You summoned me," Vance said, voice sharp. "I have come. What do you want?" Wolfe opened his eyes, heavy and calm. "I want order, Mr. Vance. You disrupt my house with your theatrics. You parade secrets, dangle threats, and presume to conscript me. That ends tonight." Vance's laugh was short and brittle. "You think you can end it, you? This ledger contains enough ruin to topple half this city. I hold it, I control it, and unless you stand with me, Wolfe, you will be its victim as surely as the rest." "Phooey," Wolfe said. "You mistake possession for power. You mistake fear for loyalty. That ledger is not control, it is a death warrant. And you, sir, are its first condemned." The room went still. Althea Drake shifted in her chair. Sloane's jaw clenched. The Harrows glanced at each other, and Hale coughed to mask his discomfort. Only Kearns remained serene, fingers resting lightly on his knee. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, the only movement that mattered. "You believe one of these present betrayed you. In truth, you betrayed them first. You extorted, you threatened, you bled them with your ledger. Now, in desperation, you summon me to guard your throne of lies. I will not." Vance's hand gripped the briefcase tighter. His knuckles whitened. "Then you choose war." "No," Wolfe said softly. "I choose truth. And it will out tonight." That was Wolfe's signal. The case had reached the boiling point, and sitting there, with the storm battering the windows and every suspect's eyes darting like trapped animals, I knew we were one move away from seeing the whole rotten feast of secrets collapse in Wolfe's office. The room had the stillness of a trap about to spring. Vance stood with his red briefcase on Wolfe's desk, like a gauntlet thrown, his chest rising and falling under the weight of his own fury. The others sat taut in their chairs, each calculating how close they were to exposure. Wolfe hadn't moved, but his voice carried the weight of a verdict not yet delivered. I was leaned against the globe, watching the air tighten. If I'd had to bet on who would break first, my money would have been on Mrs. Harrow. Her jewels trembled against her collarbone as if trying to escape. But it was Hale, the lawyer, who finally croaked out, "Wolfe, you can't sit there and lecture us like errant children. This is a matter of leverage. Vance has it, and unless you're prepared to—" "Silence," Wolfe said, and Hale's mouth clicked shut like a snapped briefcase. Wolfe's eyes settled on Vance. "You sought to enlist me by threat. You presumed I would find sanctuary in your arsenal of secrets. But you erred. For what are secrets, Mr. Vance, but debts? And debts are fragile currency," Vance sneered. "Debts are power. I control them. This book," he patted the briefcase, "is proof. Without it, each of them is nothing. With it I own them." Sloane barked a laugh, harsh and mirthless. "Own me? You threatened me, Vance, but you've got nothing. You can wag that book around like a cudgel, but all it proves is that you've made enemies. And enemies don't forget." Drake leaned forward, voice sharp. "And if that ledger falls into the wrong hands, you'd all be finished. Maybe that's what he wants, drag us down with him." The Harrows shifted uncomfortably, the husband looking at the wife with an expression that said he'd prefer not to be dragged anywhere. Through it all, Kearns remained still, eyes flicking between Wolfe and Vance. His fingers, which usually danced restlessly, were motionless now. That was enough to make me uneasy. Wolfe exhaled, slow and heavy. "You brandish this ledger as if it were a sword. But in truth it is tinder. It will burn, and you with it. The question is not whether, but when." Vance slammed the briefcase shut and snapped the locks. "You think you can frighten me into handing it over? I'll destroy you all before I yield." That was when Wolfe leaned forward just slightly, his bulk shifting with a gravity that pulled every eye in the room. "Mr. Vance, you have already yielded. You showed me the ledger when you carried it into my house. You revealed its existence to Goodwin's ears. You confessed its power by defending it too fiercely. And you exposed your betrayer the moment you summoned them here. That made the room jolt. Every pair of eyes darted around, suspicion flaring again. Vance's own eyes widened, then narrowed. "You know who?" "Yes," Wolfe said, voice calm. "I know." Nobody breathed. Then he closed his eyes, folded his hands, and said, "But it will wait. The betrayer will reveal themselves more clearly if given rope. Archie." "Yes, sir." "See them out. Tomorrow we resume." If I'd learned one thing in my years with Wolfe, it's that when he says tomorrow, it means the stew isn't ready yet. The guests filed out under a silence so taut it could have snapped the staircase banister. Vance clutched his briefcase like a lifeline. Sloane stalked out muttering. Drake's heels struck sparks. The Harrows whispered frantically. Hale looked like a man swallowing a lawsuit, and Kearns gave me that sly half-smile that made me want to check my pockets. When the last of them were gone and Fritz closed the door with a firmness that spoke for us all, I turned to Wolfe. "You really do know, don't you?" "Of course," Wolfe said. His eyes were closed again, his voice flat. "But knowledge is not enough. Timing is everything. Tonight was to unsettle. Tomorrow will be to expose." "Fine," I said. "But in case you missed it, Vance is hanging on by fingernails. If somebody pries those fingers loose before you're ready, we'll be chasing pieces instead of people." He opened his eyes, considered me for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then watch him, Archie. Saul will assist. I will require him intact until I am finished." That was Wolfe's way of sending me out into the rain, while he kept dry with beer and orchids. Saul and I tailed Vance through the night, from his club to a hotel meeting room, where he drank heavily with two nameless associates, then back to his penthouse. The red briefcase never left his grip. At 2 a.m, Saul and I met at a corner diner. He stirred his coffee, eyes half-lidded. He's unraveling. He's scared of losing that book, but he's more scared of what Wolfe will do with it. "Fear makes men careless, or dangerous," I said, "and Wolfe wants him alive and present tomorrow." "Then we'll keep him breathing," Saul said simply, as if it were no more complicated than keeping a cab in sight. By dawn I dragged myself back to the brownstone. Wolfe was already at breakfast, tucking into ham and eggs with the calm of a man who'd spent the night in bed, not shadowing a desperate extortionist. He didn't ask for details. He knew Saul and I had kept Vance safe. Instead, he leaned back, wiped his lips, and said, "Archie, prepare the office again. This time, all of them, and make certain Fritz polishes the silver. The show must gleam as well as strike. You're planning the full performance?" "Yes." His eyes closed. "Tonight the betrayer will be revealed, and the Feast of Secrets will end. I wanted to ask who, but I knew better. Wolfe would deliver it on his schedule, not mine. So I left him to his orchids, Fritz to his cooking, and myself to another day of preparation. And as the storm clouds gathered again outside, I had the distinct sense we were approaching the sharp end of Wolfe's patience and somebody else's downfall. By the time dusk settled, the brownstone was wound tight like a drum. Fritz polished the silver until it glared back at him. Saul checked in twice from his post outside, and Wolfe sat in his chair as though carved from the oak of his own desk. I arranged the chairs again in their neat semicircle, though I had the sneaking suspicion that whoever sat in them tonight wasn't going to be half so polite as yesterday's rehearsal. Wolfe didn't give orders for polish and placement because he liked the shine. He did it because when the show began, even the smallest detail needed to remind the players whose stage it was. At 8 sharp, the bell rang. Fritz ushered them in one by one. Vance first, clutching that cursed red briefcase tighter than a miser's purse. Althea Drake next, her eyes bright with the thrill of scandal not yet printed. Sloane, jaw like a vice. Hale, with his spectacles fogged and nerves showing. The Harrows, jittery in jewels. And finally Julian Kearns, who strolled in as though the entire matter were just another evening's entertainment. They sat in their assigned arc, glances darting, suspicion simmering. Vance remained standing, his briefcase perched on his lap like a shield. Wolfe, immovable behind his desk, let the silence drag long enough to make each of them shift in their seats. Then he spoke. "You have all," he said, "been summoned to witness the conclusion of Mr. Vance's folly. He parades a ledger of secrets as though it were a crown. In truth, it is a noose. Tonight we decide whose neck it fits." That earned a scoff from Vance. "You can posture all you like, Wolfe, but I hold the cards." He tapped the briefcase. "With this I can ruin every man and woman in this room. And if you think you can strip me of it—" "Phooey," Wolfe cut in. "You have already been stripped. What you clutch is not control, but evidence of your weakness. And worse, evidence of betrayal. You summoned these people to corner your Judas, but in doing so you exposed yourself. Tonight I will expose the traitor as well." The ripple that went through the room was almost audible. Mrs. Harrow gasped softly. Hale muttered a protest. Althea Drake leaned forward, her pen already scratching across the tiny notebook she carried, while Sloane sat back, arms folded, daring Wolfe to name him. Only Kearns seemed unruffled, the faintest smile curling his lips. Vance barked, "Then do it." "Name the traitor!" Wolfe closed his eyes, folded his hands, and spoke with a weight that pressed the room into silence. "Very well, Mr. Vance, your betrayer is here. But it is not who you expect. It is not Mr. Sloane, though you despise him. It is not Miss Drake, though her pen is dangerous. It is not Mr. Hale nor the Harrows. No. The hand that undermined you belongs to the man who provided you with secrets in the first place, Julian Kearns." All heads swiveled toward the wiry man at the far chair. His smile didn't falter. "Interesting," he said softly. "And why, Wolfe, do you say that?" "Because," Wolfe rumbled, "your business is information. You supplied Vance with files, letters, scandals, but you sold them again when he faltered. When he ceased to pay, you found new buyers. You betrayed him not out of vengeance, but out of commerce. That is your trade. You betrayed him because it was profitable." Vance's face turned scarlet. "You snake! I paid you a fortune." Kearns tilted his head. "Yes, and you stopped. You thought fear was enough. It wasn't." The Harrows shifted, whispering in panic. Hale mopped his brow with a handkerchief. Sloane let out a bark of laughter that echoed too loud in the tension. Vance lurched forward, fumbling at the briefcase. "I'll ruin you all. Every name in here, printed, published, screamed from the rooftops." Wolfe's voice cut through like a blade. "Sit." And somehow, impossibly, Vance obeyed. He collapsed back into his chair, the briefcase still locked in his grip, his eyes wild. "You cannot," Wolfe said, "because you are already ruined. Your ledger is known. Its contents will be dismissed as the desperate ploys of a failed extortionist. And should you attempt to wield it further, I will ensure it reaches the police, who will regard it as evidence of conspiracy to defraud and blackmail. You are finished, Mr. Vance." Vance sagged, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. Across the room, Kearns chuckled once, low and satisfied. "So it seems," he said. "Though if you think you've beaten me, Wolfe, you underestimate the demand for secrets. This game doesn't end with Harold Vance." Wolfe's eyes opened, and they were cold. "I do not underestimate, Mr. Kearns, I disregard. Men like you are vermin, feeding on what others discard. You will persist until you are crushed by the weight of one truth too heavy to sell. That is inevitable." Kearns's smile thinned, but he said nothing more. The meeting ended with no fanfare. One by one the guests filed out again, each subdued by the weight of Wolfe's pronouncement. Althea Drake gave me a look that promised a column with teeth. Sloane muttered about empires and battles yet to come. The Harrows clung to each other. Hale stumbled like a man walking out of court with a guilty verdict. Vance, defeated, carried his briefcase out like a coffin, his eyes hollow. Kearns lingered a moment longer, offered me a nod, and slipped away with the soundless tread of a man who lived in shadows. When the door closed behind the last of them, I turned to Wolfe. "So that's it?" Vance ruined, Kearns exposed, the rest shaken but standing. "For now," Wolfe said. His eyes shut, his voice low. "The matter is concluded. The ledger will vanish, its owner disgraced. But secrets, Archie, are like weeds. They return. One uprooted, another sprouts. Only vigilance keeps the garden whole. I leaned on the globe, letting out a slow breath. And who's supposed to do all that weeding? You, Wolfe said, and reached for his beer. That was the end of the night, the storm still battering outside. The office heavy with the echoes of revelations, and Wolfe as calm as ever, content to let the world crumble as long as the brownstone remained inviolate. The storm tapered off during the night, but the air the next morning still carried the weight of thunder. I came down to the office to find Wolfe in his chair, the remains of breakfast already cleared and the orchids tended. He was motionless, but I'd been around long enough to know the difference between Wolfe at rest and Wolfe in siege. This was the latter. He had a file on his desk unopened, as though waiting for it to declare itself guilty before he touched it. "You're early," I said, settling at my desk. "I am," he admitted, which was rare enough to make me pause. "Last night was unsatisfactory. You unmasked Kearns, stripped Vance, and sent the rest home whimpering. What exactly counts as satisfactory?" "The absence of uncertainty," he said, eyes closing. "And there is uncertainty." He didn't elaborate, which meant I had to dig. "You mean Kearns?" He all but confessed. "Kearns is vermin," Wolfe said flatly. "Predictable, yes, but insufficient. If he were the sole betrayer, the matter would be concluded. Yet there remains a second hand. That woke me up faster than coffee. You think there's more than one?" "There is," Wolfe said. "The ledger was a tool, yes, but the timing of its exposure, the dinner, the letters, the sudden urgency, suggests orchestration beyond Kearns's appetite for profit. Someone else guided the spectacle. We must know who. That explained his mood. Wolfe hates loose ends more than cold soup. I started running through the suspects aloud, but he stopped me with a flick of his hand. "Archie, fetch Saul." By noon, Saul was in the office, hat in hand, giving his quiet report. He had tracked Vance back to his penthouse. "The man hasn't slept. He's drinking himself stupid. The briefcase hasn't left his side. He knows he's finished. Finished men," Wolfe said, "can still lash out. Maintain observation." Saul nodded and left, leaving Wolfe and me to stew in silence. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. "Archie, today you will see Miss Drake again. Probe deeper. If she seeks to shape the narrative, she may reveal more than her column." That afternoon I found Althea Drake in her office, cigarette smoke curling around her like a crown. She gave me a smile that was equal parts charm and warning. "Goodwin, come to supply more material, or to beg me to go easy on your employer when I put this circus in print?" "Neither," I said. "But if you're planning to run your piece, you might want to consider whether you're a participant or a pawn." "Wolfe doesn't like pawns." She exhaled smoke slowly. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice. Wolfe thinks there's a second hand behind this whole setup. And you're the one with ink enough to make or break reputations. Maybe you were fed this story to play your part." Her eyes flickered just for a second, before she masked it with a laugh. "Please, I've been fed stories all my life. That doesn't mean I swallow them whole." "Then who's feeding this one?" She tapped ash into a tray, leaned forward and lowered her voice. "If you must know Harold Vance himself. He begged me to attend that dinner, said there would be revelations worth my pen. He wanted me to witness, to record, to make it immortal. If that's orchestration, Goodwin, then your genius employer is right. Vance wanted an audience." I left her office with more questions than answers. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, then grunted. So Vance, not content with extortion, sought posterity. He invited not merely allies, but chroniclers. Then indeed there is another hand, for he would not expose himself without assurance. The assurance came clearer than I expected. That evening Saul phoned again. "We've got movement. Kearns just met with Vance. Private meeting, half an hour. When Kearns left, he looked pleased. Vance looked terrified. That was enough to bring Wolfe's eyes snapping open. "Archie," he said, "tomorrow evening you will bring them all again. This farce has one act left. The stage will be mine." The next evening the suspects returned to the brownstone for what they assumed was another round of Wolfe's scolding. Fritz had prepared the office with ruthless precision, and Wolfe sat waiting like a mountain that knew the climbers couldn't reach its peak. When the room was full, Wolfe began without flourish. "You have all suffered at Mr. Vance's hands. You feared his ledger, his threats, his power. Yet what you did not see was the hand guiding him to his ruin. It was not Kearns, though he profited. It was not Drake, though she chronicled. No, his ruin was arranged by one of you who stood to gain most from his collapse." The room froze. The Harrows gripped each other's hands. Hale's spectacles slid down his nose. Sloane leaned forward, jaw set. Wolfe opened his eyes fully now, their weight pinning each guest. "The betrayer is here, and before this evening ends they will reveal themselves." That was Wolfe's style. He didn't shove the truth out into the light. He let the guilty drag it there themselves, gasping under the weight of silence. And as the storm outside began to rattle the windows again, I felt the air shift. Someone at that table was about to break. The silence in Wolfe's office had the texture of a stretched wire, ready to snap. The semicircle of suspects sat stiff and restless, the storm outside lending a percussion of rain against the windows. Wolfe, of course, hadn't budged an inch. His eyes were half closed, his lips pressed in a faint line that promised he already knew more than he was saying. And me? I leaned on the globe, arms folded, watching faces like cards in a rigged deck. Harold Vance was the first to twitch. His grip on the red briefcase had grown so tight, I half expected the leather to split. "This is a farce," he muttered, though his voice cracked. "You bring us here night after night, Wolfe, only to dangle accusations. If you know who betrayed me, name them." Wolfe's eyelids lifted a fraction. "I have named one. Kearns, who sold you and resold you. But there is another. And their silence tonight is as damning as confession." All eyes shifted, landing in quick succession on Sloane, Drake, Hale, the Harrows, then back again. Nobody spoke. The storm rattled the panes like impatient fingers. It was Althea Drake who finally broke the quiet. Her voice was sharp but controlled. "If you're suggesting I orchestrated this circus, Wolfe, you're wasting your breath. I was invited to observe, nothing more. Vance wanted an audience, and he got one. If he was fool enough to think I'd protect him, that's on him." Sloane gave a low laugh. "Convenient, isn't it? You scribble your columns, profit from the scandal, and keep your hands clean." "Too clean," Drake's eyes flashed. "And you're any better? You fought Vance tooth and nail for years. You had more to gain from his fall than any of us." Sloane leaned forward, knuckles on his knees. "If I wanted him ruined, I'd do it openly. Business is war, not whispers. Whoever played this game hides in shadows. That's not my style." I watched Wolfe closely. He didn't move, but his attention had shifted slightly imperceptibly toward the Harrows. Clifford Harrow was mopping his forehead with a handkerchief, his wife's fingers digging into his arm hard enough to leave marks. Hale, the lawyer, cleared his throat, fumbling with his spectacles. "Wolfe, this is absurd. We're here to what? To confess? To be accused until someone cracks? This isn't justice, it's theater." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "And theater reveals truth more surely than interrogation. You perform, all of you. But one of you cannot help overacting." That was when Mrs. Harrow spoke, her voice thin and brittle. We shouldn't be here. Clifford, tell them we had nothing to do with this." Her husband shot her a look sharp enough to cut glass. Quiet, it was too sharp, too sudden. Wolfe opened his eyes fully now, heavy and unblinking. "Mr. Harrow," he said, "you reveal yourself." The room shifted as if the air itself recoiled. Harrow stammered, "That's ridiculous. I've done nothing. Vance has been my associate, my partner." "Your rival," Wolfe corrected. "You sought to eclipse him. Your debts were mounting, your ventures floundering. Vance's extortion threatened you most, so you contrived this spectacle. Feeding Kearns, guiding Vance to summon his enemies, ensuring his exposure. You did not seek to escape the ledger, Mr. Harrow. You sought to bury it and him." Clifford Harrow's face blanched, his wife's grip tightening on his arm. "Lies," he whispered, but his voice held no weight. Sloane gave a bark of laughter. Well, I'll be damned. The Diamond King reduced to back-alley schemer. Enough, Wolfe said, and the laughter died. Mr. Harrow, your guilt is not in doubt. You sought to end Vance's reign by turning his own weapon against him. But you miscalculated. By drawing me in, you invited scrutiny beyond your control. Vance surged to his feet, the briefcase clutched to his chest. So it was you, he hissed at Harrow. You undermined me, fed Kearns, planted whispers. Harrow snapped. You brought it on yourself, Harold. You bled us all, held us hostage with your damned ledger. I did what I had to. The confession, raw and unguarded, echoed in the office. Mrs. Harrow sobbed once quietly. Wolfe raised a hand, silencing them all. Mr. Harrow, your machinations have destroyed you. You will leave this house tonight, knowing your power is ended. Whether Vance pursues revenge, whether your associates abandon you, that is no concern of mine. What matters is that this house is no longer disturbed. He closed his eyes again, signaling dismissal. Fritz appeared at the doorway as if on cue, ready to usher them out. The guests filed out in a daze, Drake with her notebook clutched like treasure, Sloane shaking his head with a grim smile, Hale stumbling like a man who'd lost his last case, the Harrows silent and broken. Vance lingered a moment, glaring at Wolfe's immovable form, before storming into the rain with his briefcase hugged tight. Kearns followed last, still smiling, though the edges were sharper now. When the door shut behind them, I turned to Wolfe. So that's it. Harrow's the hidden hand, Kearns the profiteer, Vance the fool. Curtain down? Not quite, Wolfe said, his voice low. Harrow revealed himself, yes, but his collapse does not conclude the matter. There remains the ledger, and what Vance will do with it now that his enemies are unmasked. I let out a slow breath. Which means we're not done babysitting him. Indeed, Wolfe murmured, folding his hands. The feast is nearly ended, but the final morsel remains, and it may yet prove poisonous. The storm outside gave a final rumble, as though seconding Wolfe's verdict. Inside the brownstone was quiet again, but I could feel it. The case wasn't finished. Not until the ledger itself was stripped of its power. The brownstone settled into its usual rhythm the next morning, but I knew better than to think Wolfe considered the case finished. He'd unmasked Harrow as the hand guiding the betrayal, yes, and Kearns as the parasite who profited from it, but Wolfe wasn't interested in personalities so much as in the ledger itself. That book was the real menace, still in Vance's possession, still heavy with enough secrets to poison half the city. Until it was dealt with, Wolfe would remain braced no matter how still he looked in that chair. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when Saul phoned in. Our friend Vance hasn't left his penthouse since last night, he said. The lights burned until dawn. He's rattled. Looks like he's rereading that ledger like it's scripture. Keep close, I told him. Wolfe's not done yet. When I relayed it, Wolfe opened one eye. He will not rest until he has tried one last play. Men like Vance cannot accept defeat. They must exhaust every possibility before collapsing. We shall oblige him. Meaning what? Meaning, Archie, you will go to him. Offer him the chance to bring his ledger here voluntarily. Suggest that refusal will ensure his final ruin. He will resist, but desperation will drive him to comply. I wasn't crazy about the errand, but Wolfe didn't phrase requests. He issued inevitabilities. So by noon I was standing outside Vance's penthouse door, pressing the buzzer. It took a full 2 minutes before he answered, disheveled, eyes bloodshot, the red briefcase still clutched in one hand. Goodwin, he said flatly. Has Wolfe finally decided to crawl to me? Not exactly. He's giving you an out. Bring that book to him. Let him see it, and maybe you'll walk away with scraps of your reputation intact. Refuse, and he'll see to it you're remembered as a desperate blackmailer who strangled himself with his own rope. Vance barked a laugh that ended too sharply. You think he frightens me? I still hold everything. He patted the briefcase. With this I can trade, I can bargain. There are men who will pay handsomely for what I know. Yeah, I said, and there are men who'll pay more to make sure you don't talk. You're living on borrowed hours, Vance. Wolfe's giving you the only deal worth taking. His eyes twitched, and for a moment I thought he might slam the door in my face. But then his grip on the briefcase shifted, less certain. He said, "Tell Wolfe tonight. I'll come tonight." Then he shut the door before I could push further. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe listened to the report with eyes closed, lips pressed thin. As I predicted, he clings to the illusion of control, but fear gnaws him. He will come. Prepare the office, Archie. Tonight the ledger itself enters this house. The day dragged, the storm clouds gathering again like actors waiting for their cue. Fritz cooked as though nothing unusual loomed, but even he banged pots louder than usual. Wolfe spent the afternoon with the orchids, as if a room of flowers could shield him from the stench of human folly he was about to endure. At precisely 8, the bell rang. Fritz opened the door, and there was Harold Vance, drenched from rain, the red briefcase hugged to his chest. He looked like a man carrying his own coffin. I ushered him into the office, where Wolfe sat immovable, waiting. Vance placed the briefcase on the desk with a thud. His hands trembled as he fumbled the locks. "Here it is. My empire, my weapon, my curse. You wanted it. Take it." The clasps clicked open and the lid swung back. Inside lay the infamous red ledger, thick with pages of names, notes, scandals, and debts. Even from where I stood, I could see the neat damning columns. Wolfe didn't touch it. He merely gazed, eyes narrowing. So, the feast is laid bare, and what a sordid feast it is. Vance leaned forward, desperate. "You see? With this I can still fight. I can still bargain. These people, Harrow, Sloane, Drake, Hale, they will pay anything to keep these pages hidden. You can help me, Wolfe. With your mind and my ledger we could—" "Boy," Wolfe said, his voice like a hammer on stone. "You mistake me utterly. I will not wield your filth. I will expose it. That is the only course that ends this charade." Vance's face contorted. "You destroy me." "You destroyed yourself," Wolfe replied. "The moment you began feeding on others' shame, you condemned yourself. I merely hastened the reckoning." For a long moment Vance stared at him, breathing hard. Then his shoulders sagged, and he sank into the red leather chair like a man finally conceding his own funeral. "Do what you will," he whispered. Wolfe closed his eyes, folding his hands. "Archie, take the ledger. Secure it." I stepped forward, lifted the book from the briefcase, and carried it to Wolfe's desk. The thing was heavier than it looked, and not just from paper. It was a weight of lives, fortunes, reputations, every line a dagger aimed at someone's throat. Wolfe didn't open it. He simply rested his hand on the cover. "The meal is over. The Feast of Secrets ends tonight." Vance rose unsteadily, clutching his empty briefcase. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Without the ledger, he was just a man in a wetsuit, trembling in defeat. He turned to the door without another word, and Fritz showed him out into the rain. When the door clicked shut, I looked at Wolfe. "So now what? Burn it? Publish it? Frame it for the orchids?" His eyes opened, sharp and heavy. "Neither. This ledger is poison. To destroy it would tempt disbelief. To wield it would corrupt. Instead, we shall render it inert. The guilty will be confronted privately with their entries. They will know they are known. Fear will bind them, not free them. That is justice enough." I closed the briefcase and set it aside, the storm outside swelling as if applauding Wolfe's verdict. Inside, the brownstone was steady again, order reasserted. The ledger was here, and Wolfe, without moving more than an inch, had claimed the final piece. But as I watched him, eyes shut, fingers folded, I knew the end wasn't quite upon us yet. Wolfe would have one more revelation, one more pronouncement to deliver before the curtain could fall. And I'd be there, as always, to put it in the record. The ledger sat on Wolfe's desk like a sleeping serpent, silent but dangerous. Even closed, it seemed to radiate the tension of every name inside. I'd handled plenty of evidence before, guns, knives, envelopes of cash. But this book was different. This wasn't a weapon you held in your hand. It was one that reached into every life it touched and squeezed. Wolfe hadn't moved since placing his palm on it, as though sheer weight of presence, could keep it from springing open and spitting poison across the room. That night passed with Wolfe in his chair, the ledger untouched, and me pacing the office until Fritz brought supper. Wolfe ate mechanically, which is saying something for him. He neither praised nor criticized Fritz's ragout, which worried me more than any outburst would have. When Wolfe doesn't notice the food, something's brewing. The next morning I found him at the desk again. The book remained where I'd left it, closed, but Wolfe had a look in his eye I'd seen before. It was the expression he wore when the case was just shy of its breaking point, and he was waiting for the last fracture. "Archie," he said, without opening his eyes, "we will summon them all once more tonight. Again? Wolfe, you're running this like a Broadway preview, night after night until the audience stops clapping. What's left to show them?" "The conclusion," he said simply. "Harrow, Kearns, Vance, they are exposed, yes, but not resolved. The others remain unsettled, fearing exposure. Fear must be replaced with certainty. That certainty will come tonight." So I made the calls. Sloane, who cursed but agreed to come. Drake, who sounded positively gleeful at the promise of more copy. Hale, who tried to refuse but wilted when I told him Wolfe insisted. The Harrows, who didn't answer at first but finally agreed after a long silence. And Kearns, who chuckled down the line and said he wouldn't miss it for the world. By 8 o'clock the chairs were filled again. Vance slouched in his seat this time, the red briefcase gone, his eyes hollow. Sloane looked ready for combat. Drake had her notebook, Hale his damp handkerchief, the Harrows their misery, and Kearns his damnable smile. Wolfe sat as before, immovable, the ledger resting before him like the centerpiece of a feast no one wanted to eat. He began without preamble. "You have all feared this ledger. You have all believed it held your ruin. That belief is both true and false. True because its pages contain your indiscretions, false because its power is spent. It is here in my possession, and it will not leave this house with any of you." That got the reaction he wanted. Sloane leaned forward. "You mean to keep it? To hold it over us yourself?" "Foy," Wolfe said. "I have no interest in your petty missteps. I am not a blackmailer. I am a man who requires order. And order requires this ledger be stripped of power. Tonight I strip it." Drake's pen scratched furiously. Hale mopped his brow. Mrs. Harrow whispered something to her husband, who stared straight ahead like a man walking to gallows. Wolfe continued, "Mr. Harrow, you sought to orchestrate Vance's fall. You will face the collapse of your ventures not by my hand, but by the natural consequence of exposure. Mr. Kearns, you profited by selling what was not yours. You will persist as vermin do until crushed. Mr. Vance—" He turned his gaze on the slumped man. "You are finished. Without your ledger, you are nothing. And with it here, you cannot revive." Vance jerked upright. "You think you can decide that? That you can just erase me?" His voice cracked raw. "That book is my life. Without it, I'm ruined." "You were ruined the moment you wrote the first line," Wolfe said. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Wolfe lifted one hand and gestured to me. "Archie." I opened the ledger, holding it up so the gathered could see the damning pages. Rows of names, dates, payments, threats. Every eye in the room latched onto it as if staring down their own obituary. "Each of you," Wolfe said, "has believed these pages your death. In truth, they are merely a mirror. They show your weakness, your folly, your corruption. But they are powerless now. I will not publish them. I will not burn them. I will consign them to silence. You will know they exist, but you will also know that they will never again be wielded." Drake lowered her pen, frowning. "So you bury the story?" "I preserve order," Wolfe corrected. "Your column may sparkle with innuendo, Miss Drake, but it will do so without this ledger. If you attempt otherwise, I will ensure you are known as a charlatan." Sloane gave a dry laugh. "So we're spared?" "No," Wolfe said. "You are condemned to your own consciences. The ledger will never torment you again, but you will never forget that it was here opened known. That is sufficient punishment." Harrow buried his face in his hands. Hale exhaled as though acquitted of murder. Vance slumped further, muttering incoherently. Kearns alone chuckled. "You're clever, Wolfe, but secrets never die. Someone will always dig them up again." "Perhaps," Wolfe said, "but not here. Not in this house." With that, he closed the ledger and placed it in a drawer. The sound of the lock clicking shut was louder than the storm outside. The case, the fear, the festering tension, it all collapsed into that one sound. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closing. "You are dismissed." "Leave my house." One by one they left. Drake first, muttering about wasted ink. Sloane, jaw tight but lighter than before. Hale staggering out like a man reprieved. The Harrows silent and broken. Kearns with his sly smile intact. And Vance last, empty briefcase in hand, shoulders sagging under the weight of his fall. When the door closed behind them, the house was quiet again. I turned to Wolfe. "So that's it. You hold the book, they hold their shame, and life goes on?" "Exactly," Wolfe said. His eyes remained shut. "The feast has ended. All that remains are the bones." I poured myself a drink, settling into the chair across from him. "And you get the last word, as usual." "No," he murmured, "you do. Write it." And so I did. The brownstone had that hollow quiet it gets after a storm of visitors has blown through. Fritz padded around softly in the kitchen. The orchids up in the plant rooms were basking in their regulated paradise, and Wolfe sat in his chair as though the last week had never happened. If it weren't for the locked drawer in his desk, you could almost pretend there had never been a ledger. Never a parade of desperate suspects. Never the scent of blackmail hanging in the air. Almost I didn't buy it. Wolfe might call the matter concluded, but I'd learned over the years that concluded in his language didn't mean gone. It meant contained, and a container can always crack. The day after the final gathering, Saul came by. Wolfe had summoned him with a note, handwritten, sealed, as formal as a summons to court. Saul settled in across from me while Wolfe dictated instructions with the gravity of a general ordering troop movements. "You will watch Vance," he said. "Not closely enough to provoke, but closely enough to know. If he seeks to barter what he no longer has, I want word." Saul nodded once. "Understood." After he left, I gave Wolfe a look. "You don't trust the drawer." "I trust wood and metal," Wolfe said. "I do not trust men. Vance has lost his weapon, but desperation may drive him to fabricate another. Desperation is dangerous, Archie. It must be observed." That was Wolfe in a nutshell, less worried about the snake you can see than the one slithering in tall grass. By evening, my phone rang. It was Saul. "You were right." Vance made 2 calls. First to a banker downtown, then to a name I don't know, Feldman. Met him in a bar. Looked like a negotiation, but Vance left empty-handed. I relayed it. Wolfe merely grunted, but I could tell the report pleased him. The man hated exertion, but he adored confirmation. 2 days passed. On the 3rd, the front bell rang at noon. Fritz answered, and a moment later Althea Drake swept into the office like she owned it. She carried no notebook this time, just a handbag and a look of controlled triumph. "Wolfe," she said, "I've come to offer you a courtesy. I won't print the ledger. You've cowed me into silence, fine, but I will print the fallout. Harrow's ventures collapsing, Sloane circling like a hawk, Vance unraveling. These are stories, and they're mine." Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "Do as you please. Your pen cannot hurt me, Miss Drake." She frowned, clearly unsatisfied. "But it can hurt them. And that's what matters. That is their problem," Wolfe said. "Not mine." I escorted her out before she could sputter herself into an ulcer. On the stoop, she turned and gave me a smile that was more knife than charm. "Your employer thinks he's ended this. He hasn't. Stories don't end just because he closes a drawer." She swept off down the steps before I could answer. When I came back, Wolfe was pouring beer. "She will write," he said. "Let her. Her words will sting, but only truth wounds. The ledger is gone from play. That is sufficient." But even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't finished. He had that look again, the one that meant the last stone hadn't yet been turned. That evening Saul phoned with another update. Vance again. He's unraveling fast. Met with Hale the lawyer. Tried to convince him the ledger was still his. Hale left in a hurry. If I had to guess, Vance is trying to bluff with an empty hand. I reported it. Wolfe opened his eyes and stared at the locked drawer for a long time. Then he said, "Archie, tomorrow evening you will bring Vance here one final time, alone." I knew better than to ask what for. The next night Vance arrived. He looked worse than before. Hollow cheeks, shaking hands, suit rumpled. The red briefcase was gone. He stood before Wolfe's desk like a man begging judgment. "You've ruined me," he said hoarsely. "Without that book, I'm nothing." "You were nothing with it," Wolfe replied. "Now you are merely forced to recognize it." "I can't live like this," Vance muttered. "I need something. A chance, anything." Wolfe opened the drawer, lifted the ledger and set it on the desk. Vance's eyes locked on it like a starving man on bread. His hand twitched forward, then stopped when Wolfe spoke. "You cannot have it, but you will see it. You will know that it exists intact, but forever beyond your reach. That is your punishment, and your lesson." Vance stared at it for a long time, tears welling. Then he whispered, "You're a devil." "No," Wolfe said softly. "I am a gardener. I prune rot." With that he closed the book, locked it away again, and rang for Fritz. Vance was escorted out, stumbling like a drunk, though I knew he hadn't touched a drop in our house. When the door shut, Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. "It is finished now." I wasn't sure if he was talking about the case or Vance or the ledger itself. Maybe all three. The brownstone settled again, quiet as stone. Fritz prepared dinner. The orchids breathed their humid air, and Wolfe reached for his beer. But me, I couldn't shake the image of Vance's face as he looked at that ledger, broken and desperate. Wolfe might call it justice. Maybe it was. But it felt more like watching a man bury himself alive, one shovelful at a time. And I knew this much. If secrets are weeds, like Wolfe said, then the garden outside those walls was still overgrown. All Wolfe had done was fence it off. The night after Vance's final visit, the brownstone was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Even Fritz, who usually hummed in the kitchen while he worked, moved about in silence. Wolfe had retreated into himself, orchids in the morning, beer in the afternoon, and an impenetrable wall of stillness in the office. The drawer remained locked, the ledger inside, its weight pressing down on the atmosphere like a storm cloud that refused to burst. I gave him space the first day, but by the second I couldn't stand the tension anymore. "Wolfe," I said, leaning back in my chair, "I don't know if you've noticed, but you're acting like a man who invited a corpse into his house and forgot to bury it. That drawer is rattling louder than a brass band." He opened his eyes, gave me a long, baleful look and said, "Archie, your penchant for metaphor would be more tolerable if it were less accurate." "Then what's the plan?" "You told Vance it was finished. You told me it was finished, but I can tell from the way you're glaring at the desk that it's not finished." He sighed, the kind of sigh that shifts his bulk an inch deeper into the chair. "It will be finished when the ledger ceases to exist. Not merely physically, but symbolically. Until then it festers. I let that hang. Wolfe doesn't often admit when something festers. It meant he was unsettled, which was worse than if he'd been furious. That evening Saul checked in again. Vance was gone from his penthouse. The doorman had seen him leave with a suitcase. Destination unknown. "Looks like he's running," Saul said. When I relayed it, Wolfe nodded once. "Then his story is ended. He will vanish into obscurity or destruction. It no longer concerns us, but I wasn't so sure. People like Vance don't fade. They claw-scrape, reappear in new corners. Still, Wolfe's tone made it clear the subject was closed. 3 days later, Althea Drake's column hit the stands. She hadn't written about the ledger. She knew better. But she had written about the collapse of Harold Vance, laying out his unraveling with just enough detail to sting every name tied to him. The Harrows were described as beleaguered, socialites clinging to vanishing prestige. Sloane was painted as the last man standing in a battlefield of ruin. Hale was the lawyer whose silence spoke louder than defense. When I read it aloud in the office, Wolfe merely grunted. She serves her readers. Pfui, let her. It accelerates the natural decay. Later that day, Clifford Harrow himself called. His voice was thin, stripped of arrogance. Wolfe, my wife and I are leaving the city. We cannot stay under this shadow. You've made your point. May God damn you for it. Wolfe hung up without replying. By the week's end, only one figure from the whole circus remained untouched. Julian Kearns. He hadn't been mentioned in Drake's column, hadn't appeared in gossip, hadn't made a sound, which, knowing Kearns, was exactly what made Wolfe twitch. Sure enough, the following afternoon, a note arrived by courier. No signature, just a single sentence written in a slanted hand. Secrets never die. They only change owners. I brought it into the office, set it on Wolfe's desk. He stared at it for a long moment, before folding it neatly and sliding it into the same drawer as the ledger. Archie, he said, make no mistake. Kearns will circle again. Vermin are tireless, but this house will not be disturbed further. Not by him. That night at dinner, Wolfe ate slowly, savouring Fritz's duck à l'orange as though to reassert order with each bite. When dessert was cleared, he leaned back, hands on his belly, and spoke with a finality I'd been waiting for. Archie, the ledger will remain here, locked and silent. It will never leave this house. It is a relic, not a weapon. Those who feared it have been stripped of illusion. Those who sought to wield it are destroyed or fled. Justice, imperfect but sufficient, is achieved. I poured myself a brandy and gave him a look. So we keep it here forever. Like some kind of trophy? Not a trophy, Wolfe said. A reminder. Appetite without restraint devours itself. Ambition without honor collapses. Secrets without discretion become ruin. The ledger is not theirs now. It is mine, not for use but for meaning. He closed his eyes and I knew the case was truly over. The brownstone had reclaimed its sanctity. The orchids upstairs bloomed in peace. Fritz prepared meals with renewed cheer, and Wolfe had restored the one thing he valued above all, order. As for me, I sat back in my chair, letting the quiet settle. Cases like this don't vanish. They leave stains, shadows, echoes. But Wolfe was right. The ledger was no longer a weapon. It was a symbol, and symbols only have the power we grant them. Still, I couldn't help thinking about that note from Kearns. Secrets never die. He was right, damn him. They'd surface again somewhere in some new form. And when they did, I knew Wolfe would be here. Orchids overhead, beer in hand, mind sharp as ever. Hand me Archie Goodwin. I'd be ready to write it down. Because the feast of secrets might have ended in Wolfe's office. But in New York City, there's always another course waiting. The evening was calm, almost unnaturally so, as though the city itself had agreed to let the brownstone breathe again. Wolfe had finished dinner, veal with morels, Fritz at his finest, and now sat in his chair with the serenity of a man who had tamed chaos without ever lifting more than a finger. I had the ledger open on my lap, not to read but to close. The pages were dense with ruin, but the words no longer had teeth. Wolfe watched me and finally spoke. Archie, the world believes destruction is an event. In truth, it is a process. Vance destroyed himself by beginning it. Harrow by scheming with it, Kearns by profiting from it. All I did was hasten what was inevitable. Sure, I said, snapping the cover shut. But you're leaving out one thing. Without you, they'd still be gnawing at each other's throats. You didn't just hasten it, you finished it. He inclined his head slightly, accepting the point but not indulging it. I finished nothing. I restored silence. That is all. Silence, it really was the right word. The house had it now, thick and clean, the kind that tells you the walls are yours again. Outside, men would still trade secrets, blackmail would still fester, and opportunists like Kearns would still circle. But here, Wolfe had drawn the line. I slid the ledger back into the drawer, locked it, and leaned back. So that's the epitaph of this one. Secrets exposed, power broken, brownstone intact. What's next? What is always next? Wolfe murmured, eyes closing. Dinner, orchids, and beer. And when folly intrudes again, as it will, we shall attend to it. That was Wolfe's philosophy, stripped to its bones. Not conquest, not triumph, just vigilance, and the steady defense of order against the noise outside. I stood, stretched, and looked around the office that had once again become what it always was. His fortress, my workplace, and the only courtroom New York really needed. Wolfe had rendered judgment, and everyone else would live or fail by it. As I switched off the light, I couldn't resist one last quip. Well, boss, you may call it silence, but me, I'll call it a hell of a story, and that's how it ended. The ledger locked away, Wolfe in his chair, orchids above, and the brownstone breathing easy again. The feast of secrets was finished, and all that remained was the telling.